Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another program called Supporting a Healthy Lifestyle, brought to you by the Kansas Avenue Health Ministries Department. We are so happy to have everyone here with us, and we want you to remember to like, subscribe, and share this program with everyone. Go ahead and text everyone you know that we're on right now with our famous Dr. Batiste, a cardiologist from Kaiser. And we also want to keep in mind and pray for our Ukraine brothers and sisters and our Russian brothers and sisters as they're going through this time. We thank God for all of His grace and mercy, and we're so pleased that God has imparted all this knowledge to Dr. Batiste to bring to us how we can improve our lifestyle. We have an interesting title for you today, and it's How Getting Selfish is Good for Your Health. So we're looking forward to hearing from Dr. Batiste how selfish we can get, because I'm thinking that selfish means I can get whatever I want. But I have a feeling that Dr. Batiste has a different idea about me eating whatever I want. So let's get right into it. Let me introduce Columbus D. Batiste. He is a board certified interventional cardiologist and assistant clinical professor at the University of California, Riverside School of Medicine. From 2008 until 2020, he has served as chief of cardiology. Dr. Batiste currently serves as regional medical director of home-based cardiac rehab and chair of the Regional Cardiac Quality Committee for Southern California Permanente Medical Group. Over the years, Dr. Batiste has been recognized for his work in the community and abroad by multiple organizations. In 2010, Dr. Batiste sought to break the cycle of prescriptions and procedures as the sole management of chronic disease and began promoting a long-term solution for his patients through nutrition, stress reduction, and exercise. As a result, in 2011, Dr. Batiste established the Integrative Cardiovascular Disease Program based at Kaiser Permanente. This program sought to prevent the reoccurrence of major adverse cardiovascular disease by focusing on lifestyle modification. In 2016, Dr. Batiste led a group that collaborated with Samsung Technologies and developed a virtual cardiac rehabilitation program utilizing a Samsung wearable. Since its launch, the program, which applies the principles of lifestyle, has treated nearly 10,000 patients. Dr. Batiste's mission is to share information so that each one can teach one about the benefits of plant-based nutrition, daily exercise, stress reduction, and thereby control their health. Understanding that the health of an individual is uniquely tied to their community, Dr. Batiste collaborated on the formation of a nonprofit organization called the Healthy Heart Nation. This mission of the mission of the Healthy Heart Nation is to improve the health of the community by narrowing disparities in education, business, justice, and ultimately health, otherwise described as the social determinants of health. Please welcome today Dr. Batiste D. Columbus. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Dr. Columbus Batiste.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent, excellent. We're excited to have you here.
All right. Well, let's dig into it. Let's go and get into figuring out how selfish is going to alter your health. And that's really the title of today's subject matter. So let's dive into that. All right. Let me switch over. Marvelous, marvelous. So I know many out there are kind of wondering what on earth is he talking about in saying being selfish is good for your health. But it is. There is a distinct connection between your health and kind of what we do. And so, as we kind of get into this, and this is, Kansas Avenue is my home church. It is a church. I am Seventh-day Adventist. And so when we look at the state of health, one of the things that has really come to bear is that the empty pews in churches across the nation are really truly a public health crisis. And we've heard a lot about public health issues and crises as of late, especially during COVID: guns, addiction, violence, the COVID-19 virus. But empty pews? Well, it was this particular article in Christianity Today that shed some light and really piqued my interest as they spoke about the fact of the church aging, about the attendance being down, and about how going to church is actually good for your health. And so we want to touch on some of those things as we go through today. And as we look, we know that despite the fact that things are opening back up, 98% of Protestant pastors say their churches are meeting back in person, but three-quarters say they are still below the pandemic attendance, the pre-pandemic attendance. And African American pastors, they report, according to this lifestyle survey, that 12 and a half times as likely as white pastors to say that their attendance is less than 30% of what it was before COVID-19. So we're seeing that these empty pews are really pervasive across the country. While one of the things we notice too as well inside of churches is, while a quarter of religious communities are at least half senior citizens, some congregations are more likely to be lacking the youth. And so what we're seeing is that really among mainline Protestants, that means across all denominations, 42% of the churches are at least half 65 years of age and older. That means over 50% of their population are 65 years and older, which means the church is aging. Now, what does that mean from a health perspective? Well, what it means is we know that that young adults, they make up 23% of the population, but only 14% of the churches. Why is this important? 80% of adults 65 and older have at least one chronic condition. 68% have two or more chronic conditions. What's a chronic condition? High blood pressure, diabetes. And so what we know is across all demographics, we look across the United States as large, 60% have one chronic disease or more. Do you have a chronic disease? High blood pressure, high heart disease, diabetes, etc. 40% of the population have two or more chronic diseases that are younger than, as you look at the totality of things. So when we see all these things happen and we understand that 66% of US adults are taking a prescription drug on any daily basis, 85% or older are using prescription drugs. So we know that these ailments are resulting in 70% of all the deaths in America, killing more than 1.7 million people per year, this thing called chronic disease. It's an issue. Now, how does it impact us inside the African American community, the Black and brown communities? We know African Americans are more likely than people in other racial ethnic groups to die from heart disease and stroke, right? That you're going to end up coming to see someone like myself. More than half of all African Americans have high blood pressure. Have you had your blood pressure checked? Do you know your values for your blood pressure? Right? Do you know that it should be less than 120/80? We understand that African Americans are twice as likely to have diabetes. The American Diabetic Association reports that every 17 seconds, a person is diagnosed with diabetes. Have you had yourself screened recently? Do you know what your A1C is? A reflection of how the glycosylation of your hemoglobin over the prior 3 months. Do you have a perspective on that? We understand that for cancers, African Americans have the highest death rate and the shortest survival. That means that we're dying and we're living shorter lives than any group in the United States across the board, irrespective of the type of cancer. What does this tell us? Additional studies tell us, and we look at Medicare beneficiaries under the age of 65. Now, here's the catch. This means that during your working years, when your wealth building years, under the age of 65, that we see in the largest percentage of individuals who have long-term disability are people of African descent. Not only that, we also see the fact that across the same parameters, we see the years of life, your longevity is shorter if you're of African descent. So not only are you having a greater degree of chronic disease, we're seeing too as well that you're likely to live sicker and die sooner. It's not just the members of the church. It's not just the members of the church. We are seeing this also from our leaders, from our pastors as well. The reports are flooding in of the catastrophe of health ailments that's striking our pastors. Reports have been inside and outside of denominations that in 2019, the Baltimore Sun reported that Reverend Charles Franklin, pastor of the Ray of Hope Baptist Church in Northeast Baltimore, he died that Sunday after of an apparent heart attack. He was only 47 years of age. He had finished completing his sermon. had finished serving communion, went into his office and was found down in that moment. This is not a standalone. It's not something that is isolated to a gender. It's not isolated to an ethnicity. We're seeing that this is ravaging all segments of the population inside and outside the church, from our members to our leaders as pastors. It's not a unique story. And so it begs the question of what age does disease start to happen? Does it happen when we're young, or does it happen when we're old? When is it that it happens? Now we see in many instances that this occurs at young ages, younger and younger and younger. In the 20s and 30s and 40s, that studies are showing that people of African descent are found to have the diseases of people of elderly ages. This is one of the first times that there's concern over the past 10 years that this generation will not outlive their parents. Not at all. When we look in as it pertains to cardiovascular disease, it's not surprising that coronary disease is the number one killer across all age groups. It becomes progressive as we increase in age. It's not a disease of the old, it's a disease of the young. It starts before the ages of 10 when you're having those parties at Chuck E. Cheese. I'm sorry, you're having those pizza parties. You're having the outings to the play zone at the Golden Arches. It's a thing it starts when you're getting those treats to keep you a little bit silenced on those long car drives, that we know coronary artery disease begins. And it's important to understand this during this thing called American Heart Healthy Month, that studies have shown, and this is from one of the interventional organizations that I'm a part of for coronary interventions. And what this study revealed from years ago, this is about 2018, it showed that among young people who died of non-cardiac death, at least 13% had substantially more coronary atheromas, which means plaquing, right, than the rest of the population. And these traditional risk factors cannot account for the excess lesions. So what we're knowing is that we know that the blockages, the plaquing, it begins at a young age and it slowly progresses. That's going to be the vast majority. But in smaller groups, you're going to see a high progression of this plaque development at a young age. And so that's where studies have done from the Korean conflict, from Vietnam, from autopsy studies have shown that individuals 18, 19, 20, some of whom have gone through basic training, that they still suffer with significantly narrowed coronary arteries. But this isn't just a disease of the heart. You see, the vascular system ranges from your head to your toes. We wonder about the impact of stroke and Alzheimer's. We wonder about the impact of diabetes and on our legs and a thing called erectile dysfunction, that all these things stimulate from the vascular system. And so we know we're beautifully and wonderfully made. And so when you're born, everything is smooth and is great. You have three layers inside the vessels. You have the inner layer called the intima, the middle layer called the media, and the outer layer called the adventitia. I tell you, it's such a wonderful, miraculous thing, the way the body was meant to be made. It reminds me a little bit of something called a Teflon pan. I'm not sure if any of you cooks out there have ever cooked on the Teflon pan. You know, when you put anything on that Teflon pan, nothing sticks to it. You can crack an egg, it's not sticking to it. You can add cheese to it, it's not sticking to it. You don't have to worry at all. And this is like the inner lining of your vessels. It's active, it's resistant to disease, and it submits chemicals that will allow it to dilate as you need more blood. It will allow it to constrict when you're upset. It's very reactive and it's a part of your body. But what happens over time? What happens over time when wear and tear begins to happen? What happens when we begin to abuse that vessel? It looks like that Teflon pan. I'm not sure if any of you have seen this before in your kitchens. Now that coating is eroded. Everything sticks to it when you're grilling and you're doing different things. And so the same thing happens in your vessels. It's no longer able to secrete the active ingredient. And as a result, there begins to be this plaque buildup, this fatty streak. It progresses until all of a sudden one day you're angry. Well, all of a sudden you're frustrated. All of a sudden you're stuck in traffic. All of a sudden the kids are arguing at you. All of a sudden your significant other is fussing at you. All of a sudden you can't seem to get relief and you feel this sensation in your back. You feel this sensation in your throat. You feel this sensation of shortness of breath. and you wonder what's going on and you brush it off. But and the reality is, it may be the beginnings of a heart attack. As you get a plaque rupture, that means a little tear in the vessel, not towards the most significantly narrow portion, but towards the area that is less narrowed. And the body begins to respond in a healing fashion, which is what we're beautifully and wonderfully made. However, there's one caveat. The body overreacts, like I overreact sometimes and I can't find what I'm looking for. I overreact to the kids, and all of a sudden the body overreacts, and we see this progression that begins to happen before now the vessel is occluded and a heart attack happens. And you come and see someone like me. This vascular dysfunction, this happens, as I mentioned, from head to toe. It impacts everything from stroke, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, macular degeneration, heart failure, kidney failure. We see it throughout, this impact of the vascular damage. The root problem for coronary artery disease is not is a root problem for many disorders. What I want to tell you is the circulatory system. It touches everything. It touches all throughout the body, and there is one particular threat that links all of these things together. It links diseases together. And I want to propose that the true threat to health, the healthy churches and communities, is not just heart and chronic disease. I think the answer is actually found in the Bible. The answer is found in the Bible. All we can do is we can turn to the Bible for many of our answers in life. It was in Numbers 20, and it said, "So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock. And Moses said to them, 'Listen, you rebels.'" I love this term here. It says, "Must we bring you water out of the rock?" Then Moses, he raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. So we turn to Psalms 106, and it says in verse 32, it says, "They angered him also at the waters of strife, so that it went ill with Moses for their sakes, because they provoked his spirit, so that he spake unadvisedly with his lips." What kept Moses from the promised land? I would say it's one thing. It's a 6-letter word. It's called stress. You can call it anger. You can call it fear. But stress is pervasive. It's something that we all experience. What is stress? Stress is a condition, it's a feeling or experience that's perceived where demands of life exceed the personal or social resources. Now, I'll tell you, all stress isn't a bad thing, right? We need stress. You know, it exhibits this thing called fight or flight, that when you need to kind of get ramped up, when you're LeBron James shooting that last shot, when you're Dak Prescott of the Dallas Cowboys and you're making that last fourth quarter pass, you need that stress hormone to help you function. Because what happens in those moments? Your pupils dilate, you get tunnel vision, you're focused, your breathing becomes shallow. All these things happen. And when this is created, but also what happens is that your body mobilizes for action, and it releases blood sugar, creating a semi-diabetic state. Your vessels crimp down, creating a hypertensive state. That all these things begin to happen. But this is good and useful inside of a short duration of time. But it's when we have it prolonged, when it's unabated, when it begins to happen. And what separates us from zebras out there is that we hold on. We have mental stress, that we ruminate over things that are transpiring. And too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, as exhibited by stress. That, yes, indeed, it leads us to come to this hypothesis that stress equals demands minus resources. And we have become one nation. Let me change that. One world under stress. Look at what's happening right now in the Ukraine. Look at what's happening right now inside of Russia. We see that this turmoil is there. It's impacting, it's having ripple effects of trauma, of stress that's being provoked throughout society. Is what we're seeing. And that I want to propose to you that the health of the nation, the health of the world, the health of the church is tied to stress. That, yes, indeed, our health equals resiliency divided by stress. And studies have borne this out, that chronic, unabated exposure to stress, poor social supports, limited social networks. It sounds like 2020, doesn't it? It sounds like the pandemic, that this has been shown to be linked to increased disease risk. This is a study from 2001. But here's the crazy part. As scientists begin to look at these avenues, they have begun to connect the dots as to how precisely this happens from a physiologic standpoint. And these studies have implicated that chronic stress important driver of something called metabolic syndrome. Now, what is metabolic syndrome? I see patients in clinic every single day and they say, Doc, I just have a little bit of diabetes. I got a touch of sugar diabetes. I have just a little, my pressure's just a little bit high. My belt, I had to expand just a little bit. I'm just a little big bone, right? But what I'll tell you is that all these little bits add up to a lot. And so what studies have shown is that when you have what's called central obesity, when you have a little mild hypertension, when you have mild hypercholesterolemia, that they increase your cardiovascular disease risk, increasing diabetes and all the development that's there. And there's a correlation between stress and this. We know there's a correlation between stress and disease at large. There's a correlation between stress and heart disease, coronary heart disease. There's a correlation between stress and something called the broken heart syndrome, the acute onset of an emotional stress. It could be someone inside the Ukraine who suffers with it. It could be someone who lost their pet or their animal, their loved one, who's struck by an emotional wave that basically paralyzes the heart and prevents it from contracting. This thing called stress is significant that scientists have really revealed it funnels back down to a small area of the brain called the amygdala. That's a central area for fear, for stress. And studies have shown that individuals who have higher levels of activity in this central portion of the brain are more inclined to have inflammation, more inclined to have what's called atherosclerosis or hardening of the vessels. And as they further elucidated this pathway, what they have found is that this process is what truly triggers the atherosclerotic process that leads to strokes, heart attacks, peripheral artery disease, erectile dysfunction, and the disability that impacts many Americans across the board. But I want to propose to you today that there is one unique stressor. There is a unique stressor I have to touch on since it's Black History Month. It's important for me to address this unique stressor and that people of African descent experience. It doesn't matter where you were dropped off, if it was in the Caribbean or if you remained on the mainland of Africa, if you went to South America, or if you ended up in England, there is one unique stressor that's there, and that is that of racism. Or like the great book, I mentioned this to the pastor. I said, there's a book that I stumbled upon, a phenomenal book called Caste: The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson. I encourage you to take a look at this as we reflect on the tail end of Black History Month. In this book, I'll summarize it. It analogizes how the U.S. racial environment is really a societal caste system that you're born into. Almost like you're playing a role in your station. She argues how the world perceives you and your station irrespective of your accomplishments. She hypothesizes how individuals do anything to not associate with the lowest caste, or rather associate themselves with the highest caste, which has led to colorism and the disconnection between people of African descent born outside the U.S., where individuals will note emphatically, I'm not Black. I'm West India. I'm not Black. I'm Nigerian. That there's a disconnection that happens. And so we have to begin to look at this. And so why is that? Well, because what has been shown is the fact that when individuals have a low perceived control, it's a determinant of heightened stress response and poor adaptation, that if I can't break through this caste system, that all of a sudden the stressors end up on me. If I'm in the workplace and all of a sudden I'm in the mailroom and I don't have control of my schedule or what happens, I'm at a higher stress and greater risk for heart disease than the CEO is. But there's a factor called everyday discrimination scale that was done by David Williams out of Harvard. Many of you may be familiar with his work. Impactful scale. Are you frequently treated with less courtesy than others? Frequently treated with less respect? Are you frequently receive poor service? Frequently perceived as being not smart? Frequently have people act as if they're afraid of you, act as if you're dishonest, act as if they're better than you. These are what you call microaggressions. These are microerosions that impact your well-being. I reflect on an instance here recently where I was overseeing the procedural lab as the sole interventional cardiologist, and how my opinion was overlooked for an individual who did not have the training that I had, for an individual who was not in that position, but who was of what Isabel Wilkerson would characterize as an upper caste or Caucasian in that moment. And so the impact on me in that moment of this just recently happening It made me begin to wonder, why is this happening? But I realized quickly, I'm not the only one. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your celebrity status is. This is Forrest Whitaker, an acclaimed actor and director. And the story is told from many years ago. He went to a store that was frequented by many actors, and went to purchase something, but changed his mind and walked out, where he was accosted by the individual from upper caste working behind the counter, who accused him of stealing and began to humiliate him by patting him down in front of all of the customers in that store, until realizing that no, he had not stolen anything, and allowed him to leave. And you think, well, that was just an actor, Doc. That's going to happen. But what about when we ascend to the greatest position inside the country? We all remember the Arizona governor, Brewer, who infamously wagged her finger at then President Barack Obama on the tarmac there in Arizona. Or we remember the South Carolina representative who yelled, "You lie," during a speech at the joint sessions of Congress. Everyday discrimination scale. Are you somehow not felt to be less smart? Are you somehow felt to be dishonest? These are things that erode at the health. And so I want to tell you and propose to you today that, again, your health is tied to resiliency divided by stress. And racism is indeed a form of stressor, because these studies have shown that what happens as we reflect on Heart Health Month, where African Americans lead in regards to strokes and diabetes and death from heart disease, that racism as stress reported chronic exposure to stress and racism increase the risk of blocked carotid arteries that lead to vascular issues and strokes. That racism as stress studies have shown increased coronary artery calcium scores, predictors, once again, of events with racial discriminatory stress. That yes, indeed, our stress equals demands minus resources from our old to our young. But what happens as a result? Many of us, we see this and we turn to fake resources because we have to offset the demands of life. We turn to fake resources that we think are going to help us, that are somehow motivated by this thing of avoiding pain, seeking pleasure, and conserving energy. It's called the motivational triad, in a great book called The Pleasure Trap. They outline this. This tends to be our tendency. How do we offset this thing of stress, these demands? Avoid pain, seek pleasure, conserve energy that leads to formation of bad habits. So what happens when we're stressed in life, when the demands of life get to us? We sit down and we watch television. We're going to conserve energy, right? And avoid pain. What happens when when we're stressed in life, the demands of life? We seek pleasure through the use of acceptable drugs. Maybe not inside the church, but outside, in and out, who knows? Drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana to unwind and de-stress. Fake resources. To avoid the pain by building walls in your relationship. Fear of pain, of opening yourself up. Fake resources. But there is one habit that I have observed in most of my patients, time and time again, the most acceptable habit for us to have. Many of us, we choose to go on a date with an old friend, an old companion. Some call it Ben and Jerry's. Some call it Baskin and Robbins. Some call it In and Out. But we go on these dates, and what we do is is that we find that stress equals dessert spelled backwards. The pressure that hits us, that leads to us having an acceptable form of a fake resource, thinking that it's going to offset the demands of life because it actually stimulates hormones and neurochemicals that may give you short relief, but leaves you hurting and lacking in the long run. And what we know is that food is the most widely used anti-anxiety drug in America, while exercise is the most potent and underutilized antidepressant. We engage in something called nutritional stress. Yes, indeed, it is eating disease-forming foods, but it's also not eating health-promoting foods. Our kitchen tables have turned from looking like centuries ago of green leafy vegetables and beans and fresh items to having all the colors, but none of the nutritional value. The studies have shown that poor nutrition is indeed a leading cause of early death worldwide. 1 in 2 U.S. adults have, as I mentioned, have this preventable condition due to nutrition. 1 in 3 have obesity, big bones. On any given day, 1/3 consume fast food, but studies have shown African-American women are the highest consumers at 42%. right? Of daily or having fast food on a daily basis. Eating out and time spent cooking has decreased exponentially. What these studies have shown is Americans on average eating nearly 6 times per week. The restaurant portion sizes have increased, supersize me. And as we say, we're eating on a more frequent basis. The sodium content inside of the fast food restaurants is through the roof, over 1,500. It's one teaspoon is only 2,000 milligrams. That they failed after getting tested for antibiotics. And who knows what you're eating, as more and more research is coming out about the disparities in what is reported as the meat or the bread and what's really inside of it. These things are impactful. But here's the catch, is that when we're eating these things, fast food consumption 2 to 3 times per week, studies have shown that increase your risk for coronary artery disease by 80% and type 2 diabetes by 27%. There's a significant health issue that results as we choose these things because it's convenient, because it's part of that motivational triad of avoiding pain, conserving energy, right? That's part of the thing. And so these foods are combined of three ingredients: salt, sugar, and fat. So what happens with the salt? We say, well, doc, I'm not hypertensive. I don't have nothing to worry about. Well, what we know is that if we can reduce our sodium intake across the world to 1,500 milligrams, which is less than 1 teaspoon, we can save basically $26.2 billion in healthcare, right? That's huge. And that we can reduce the cardiovascular deaths from 500 to nearly 1.2 million over the next 10 years. I'm going to tell you and propose to you today, studies have shown out of the Journal of American College of Cardiology that salt intake doesn't just affect the heart. It just doesn't affect the blood pressure. It affects everything from stem to stern. That yes, indeed, it does. It plays a role in all-cause risk of death, in cancers too as well. But it's not just that. You say, well, salt's not my thing, doc, but I do like a little sweetness, right? I like a little sweetness, a little sugar, right? And so what we know is that this added sugar, I'm a former sugarholic, all right? So I am recovering on my own. So I understand the perils of trying to overcome this, but we know it increases the risk of heart disease by 4 times. When we increase our calories from sugar, inside of all the substances, you read the ingredients, and if it ends in oats, it's a form of sugar. And this is what studies have really shown, not to mention the addictive characterization of sugar. It makes us addicted in a similar fashion to the way that cocaine does, that heroin does, in terms of its activation. And why is that? Because it's absorbed so quickly through the tongue. And it breaches the brain blood barrier quickly. Well, what about the issue of fat? Well, don't talk to me about fat, doc. I thought fat is overstated, right? But we know that there is still a significant association between fat and animal products and between disease outcomes. What the studies have shown, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, trans fats, which are typically contained inside your pastries, your donuts, and your all the other things that you may just crave inside the morning there, that these are the things, the highest association with death and demise. Next up is saturated fat. Now, what's saturated fat? Make it simple. I don't know if any of you guys are keep it real. I know Kansas, you guys are a very educated population, right? And many who tune in as well are, and so you perhaps don't cook like this any longer. But I remember the day that after frying up foods and everything, you would pour that grease inside of a glass jar and let that sit in the kitchen there, and all of a sudden it gets hard. You see it hard, it gets cloudy. That's your saturated fat. That turns to being hard, that solidifies when it's set out, is saturated fat. And that typically comes from animal products. The ones that are more beneficial for you are your plant-rich fats, your monounsaturated and your polyunsaturated fats, but more ideally, not in a process or human man-touched fashion, but in their natural states. So which foods contain saturated fats? It's going to be your animal source foods, primarily your meats and your dairies, although the coconut and palm oils do as well have it. We look across the board, who are the highest consumers of meat? It's people of African descent. We know if we look at fish, that bar to the left, it's going to be African Americans. Turkey, chicken, pork. The only one in which African Americans have not been described to having the highest consumption is that of beef. But you said, doc, I thought we were past all this. I thought it's not just the fat. And you're right. It's not. What we know is that it's greater than that. Research is showing and demonstrating the fact that there is a substance that we're more bacterial DNA and viral DNA than we actually are human DNA, and that we live symbiotically in this state of well-being with our bacteria inside of our system, our microorganisms. But what we do either feeds the good guys or feeds the bad guys. And when we consume animal proteins, animal substances, it feeds the bad guys. And they can propagate the risk for Alzheimer's, for heart disease, for kidney failure, is what we see on a consistent basis. Studies upon study upon study has shown us that as we move towards the right of the screen, processed meats should not be allowed on Earth, all the way down to plant-rich sources, the line of zero, right? That demarcates in terms of the risk, the increase or the decreased risk in terms of cardiovascular events and of death, all-cause mortality. And so your plant source proteins are the most ideal for you. And so what all this stuff tells me, once again, is that the nutritional stress plus racial stress, the poorer our health. We look across the board, these processed foods in a very similar fashion to what we just saw with the animal proteins, it reflects our burden of disease. But I want to propose to you, Kansas, it's never too late to change the direction that you're going in. And that brings us back to getting selfish. We have to get selfish. We have to learn from our pastors to the members, to our community, to our politicians. We need to be selfish. Now, what do I mean by selfish? I don't mean selfish like when I was a kid growing up and we would have to split whatever it was. And I would say, hey, she got more than I got to my sister. I want more. It's about me. I'm not saying selfish in that regards. I mean true selfish. True selfish. What do I mean by that? The S stands for spiritual. The E stands for exercise. The L stands for love. The F stands for food. The I stands for intimacy. The second S stands for sleep. And the last H stands for humor. Selfish. So let's break these down. We look spiritual from a spirituality standpoint. What do I mean? Well, even the Bible tells us. It says in Luke 5:16 that, but Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer. Right? That spirituality is so important. We look at aspects of meditation. Studies have shown from Journal of American Heart Association, the relative risk for coronary cardiovascular mortality was significantly reduced by 81% in people engaging in meditation. Now, oftentimes, many groups will say, I don't do that new age stuff. Well, meditation is simply an opportunity for you to be at rest, to be at peace from this fast moving pace, to have an opportunity to listen to perhaps what God is telling you, as opposed to just prayer of you speaking your request and your gratitude and so forth. So this reflection of this moment of peace, of silence, of deep breathing, that studies have shown that as you breathe out, you activate what's called the parasympathetic system. That means that you're able to counteract that stress hormone cascade, that you can lower your heart, relax your vessels by simply pausing. That when you begin to engage in these things, that you activate what's called the prefrontal cortex. This is the reasoning part of the brain that allows you to comprehend as you're making and deciding upon what we characterize as keystone habits. But it's not just meditation. Prayer has been shown to be beneficial. When we look as far as prayer, we know that it's been shown, especially in the Alcoholic Anonymous members, that it's associated with a relative reduction in self-reported cravings, right? You know, these cravings we get, whether or not it's the old ice cream or it's the chips or if it's the burger or the fries or the pizza or the cookies. That prayer has been shown that when we start with the spirituality with prayer and meditation, that it sets the foundation for us going forward. Because remember, as we speak to the issue of the empty pews being a public health crisis, we have to turn back to the church. I told you that there's an issue, the multiple issues that lead to the public health crises. Churches are empty. The church population is aging. But the other third one is the fact that going to church is extremely beneficial for your health. What the studies have shown is that frequent attendance from the Journal of American Medical Association, Internal Medicine, showed that frequent attendance at religious services was associated with significantly lower risk of all-cause cardiovascular and cancer mortalities amongst women. I can tell you firsthand, I grew up inside of a church inside of Tamarind, and it looks like they are frozen in time. Some of the women that are there at that church, 90, 80, look almost like I recognize them from when I was 5, 6, 10 years of age, that the Lord has preserved them and they're faithfully there in church. Now, it doesn't mean for the rest of that they will live into eternity, but all of us are going to have a start and stop time. but the components that what's comprised in the church are powerful. Then we look at another study basically showed that when we found that lack of church attendance, a surrogate for religiosity, was associated with a greater likelihood of having elevated what's called allostatic load, or basically stress. This and increased mortality. That when you did not go to church, the converse to the prior study, this one demonstrated the fact that it increases your risk of death. So we know that going to church and spirituality is extremely important. What about the E for exercise? Well, we oftentimes think of Billy Blanks. We think of Jane Fonda aerobics. That I have to do that. We think of CrossFit if we're younger. We think of all these different things. I want to propose to you today that you don't have to do any of those things to move and be active. That just you have to simply walk. You just simply have to do some sort of leisure activity that you enjoy. If it's going golfing and walking the course, if it's going out with your friends and doing whatever it is, that by doing so, 20% reduction in cardiovascular events, an increase in life expectancy of 5 years by just remaining with leisure activity, not aggressive, just leisure activity. Now, here's the thing. I love this study. Another one done by the Journal of American Heart Association. It showed that basically just activities of daily living, defined as standing, moving in a confined space, right? Just like performing housework. Come on now, don't hire those housekeepers there now, or gardening. Fire your gardener. You just simply get out there and move. That you found that in women, older women, a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. This study just came out in the past 2 weeks. The beneficial association of physical activity in terms of common behaviors, right, could help older adults accumulate physical activity. We want to remain active. I love this characterization of activity. It's called NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, just by standing, just by walking, just by cooking, just by chopping. These things have power, right? This is meant to be, and we're supposed to move. So you want to make technology work for you, not you work for technology. Still use your mind, use your body towards the beneficial end. And these studies have shown that just when you increase, people think I have to exercise an hour. I don't have time. I'm too stressed, right? We avoid pain. We want to conserve energy, that motivational triad. Keep going back to it. If you go ahead and step outside yourself and you just increase your exercise by 10 minutes, by 20 minutes, by 30 minutes, all of a sudden now we see that that the risk of death decreases exponentially the more time you add. So it's incremental. But even at the lowest, you're increasing and improving your health outcomes. Adding 10 minutes per day of physical activity resulted in an estimated 111,000 preventable deaths per year if societally we did this. What's the second? The L stand for? L stands for love. There's so much hate in this world. We see the strife. We see the images. We see the images of individuals. We saw the young boys who were tussling. One was Caucasian, one was African-American, and the police went and grabbed the African-American and allowed the other one to sit there. And it conveys this idea of anger and frustration that can lend itself towards hate. And we have to choose to love. We have to choose to love, as the Bible says. And so when we begin to do that, and we see love as on a hormonal level called oxytocin. Oxytocin is the antidote to stress. That oxytocin is whereas stress hormone, cortisol, adrenaline, epinephrine are the flight or fight. Oxytocin is the tend and befriend. Oxytocin is the hormone that causes you to want to seek out individuals to have conversations and to communicate with. The support groups, your support system that's there. That oxytocin, it protects the heart. It reduces the inflammatory response and improves cardiovascular and metabolic function. This thing, we think of it in terms of a mother and child. That oxytocin is released for this bonding hormone, but that bonding occurs even beyond. We have to embrace the aspect of what's been given to us. But love isn't just a hormone. Love is an action word. It's a verb. It's not a noun. I challenge you to say that it's a verb. And so love and action equals forgiveness. And I want to tell you that studies have shown, looking at individuals assigned to a forgiveness group, forgiving yourself, right? Forgiving yourself, forgiving others who trespass you, forgiving others who have demeaned you towards a lower caste or have given you microaggressions. That when you do this, you have fewer anger recall induced what's called myocardial perfusion, which means blood flow deficits to the heart. That as you begin to embrace forgiveness, you improve the blood flow to your heart. There's power in forgiveness, but love in action doesn't stop there. Love in action also is gratitude, being saying thank you. That being grateful by exhibiting gratitude, it impacts the biomarkers of what's called endothelial dysfunction, which means the way in which the vessels respond as they dilate and reduce. The inflammatory markers, C-reactive protein, predictors of cardiovascular events. It improves adherence to health behaviors. That love is powerful. What about the F? Food. Now, you know I'm going to go into food, so we'll get right back to food. But what about the I in intimacy? I don't mean in a sexual way. I don't mean in that relationship like that. I mean, once again, that camaraderie, that isolation, and breaking those isolation bonds. And so when a person feels isolated, when they feel as if they don't have anyone that they can communicate with, they're at a high risk and burden of cardiovascular disease. I oftentimes reflect on this characterization of intimacy like that with my mom. I would sit there and say to her, "Hey, Mom, who's your best friend?" Since after my dad passed. And she would say, Precious. I'm like, well, who's Precious? She didn't say her son, me, or my brother, her daughters. She didn't say other people. She said Precious, her dog. That she has a connection, that Precious, this sweet little dog, knows when she's hurting. She knows when she's sad. She looks out for her, that they have a bond, a relationship, a connection. And studies have affirmed this as it relates to animals and their interaction. And we see these service animals, that they serve a function. That loneliness is something that the church is set to counteract. That loneliness is indeed that when we can counteract this idea of loneliness and create intimate relationships, that we can decrease the burden of cardiovascular events, decrease dementia, decrease this isolation that's there. There's power that's there. That's what the I stands for. What about the S? The S in sleep. I'm curious, and obviously this is a virtual question for you all, but I want to know how many of you all out there listening in, tuning in, the pastor, Elder Jeanette, how many of you slept greater than 4 hours last night? Put your hands up. Now, if you slept greater than 4 hours, if you slept 6 hours, keep your hands up. How many of you slept more than 8 hours? Keep your hands up. Now, oftentimes when we're in person, those hands begin to drop. They drop like flies. All of a sudden, we see that individuals, they are sacrificing their sleep, that they feel there's more tasks that have to get done, that the demands of life exceed their resources, and they're going to go ahead and shortchange this idea called sleep. But we know that when we sleep, all of a sudden, the answers start to come true. That when we sleep, we figure out where we left those keys. All of a sudden, when we sleep, we figure out the math questions that are there. That performance improves, and studies have shown that when we engage in sleeping, right, 7 to 9 hours of sleep, that we decrease our burden of heart disease, that we decrease our death rate too as well. That when we begin the process of sleeping, that we know that there's a heightened risk of heart disease when we sleep fewer than 5 hours. These things begin to increase that are there. Multiple studies continue to come across, irrespective of your sex or your race, that we see the impact of sleep on a positive aspect when we begin to engage in. So I want to encourage you right today. Don't worry about, oh, doc, I can't sleep. All I need is 5 hours of sleep. I don't need more. I challenge you that you definitely need more. I would challenge you to go to sleep 15 minutes earlier. And you do that for 3 months. After 3 months, I want you to go 15 minutes earlier than that. Over the course of the year, you're going to sleep an hour more. Slow, small, atomic actions. Slow, small actions can lead to great changes. And that's what I want you to commit to today, Kansas. I think the H, what does the H stand for? Humor or laughter. Laughter is indeed medicine. The Psalms tells us this, that laughter is medicine, and that when we engage in laughter, all of a sudden we see that the vessels dilate, that people do much better in life, that there's a decreased burden of cardiovascular events. Now, there's so much more to go through, but we can't leave without taking a closer look at food, right? It's food. It's always been the food all along. That we have to begin the process of using food for resiliency instead of stress, even in our church potlucks, that these foods indeed fight stress, from our cruciferous vegetables and kale and broccoli and collard greens, to the spices, the turmeric, to dark chocolate, darker the berry, the sweeter the juice, to the legumes, the red beans and rice. We talk about black beans, lentils, all these things to fermented foods and the power that they have. That when we engage in this, we can decrease our burden of cardiovascular disease. And by eating green leafy vegetables can dilate the vessels of our heart, can stem the tide of billowing cancer inside of our colons and so forth. That when we engage in fruits and vegetables, it can decrease the risk of death, both from all cause and cardiovascular. That when we increase fruits and vegetables, and here's the key, eating the colored fruits are the ones that are best for you. Blueberries, blackberries, strawberries, raspberries. They don't turn brown. They're rich in antioxidants. Been shown to decrease your blood pressure, improve your blood sugar, and decrease the burden and risk of diabetes. Now we know that having whole grains. What's whole grains versus regular grains? We don't want the ones that are going to melt in your mouth, not in your hands. We want you to chew where your jaws get tight. We want you to chew where you get tired of chewing with that Ezekiel 9 bread. It decreases the all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. The beans are extremely important. Legume consumption has been shown to decrease the burden and risk of coronary heart disease. Extremely powerful. It is a substance that the blue zones are comprised of. Having nuts. Nuts are not the enemy, but not sugar-coated nuts, not butter toffee nuts, not all these nuts that are coated, but small amounts, 3 tablespoons of raw Brazil nuts, walnuts, and hazelnuts are extremely powerful in omegas that can help your body. Adding it there, but not snacking. The spice of life. This is coming up in one of the next installments of these Healthy Sundays. That's there. We want to look at the spices that are rich in antioxidants and can help your blood lipid levels. Turmeric, inflammation, cayenne pepper, all the things over and over. That when we begin the process of doing this, when we begin the process of moving from eating the red line, which is a Southern dietary pattern, to a green line, which is a plant-strong diet, plant-predominant diet, that all of a sudden our risk for acute heart disease and heart attacks decreases. That when we begin the process of moving from eating a Southern diet rich, once again, inside of meats and sugary foods and processed foods, fast foods, towards a plant-rich diet, decrease our risk of heart failure. That when we begin the process of moving from eating these things, we decrease our burden of stroke. The Adventist Health Study, it demonstrated this uniquely, that as we begin moving from eating any and everything to a plant-predominant diet, the weight falls off. The diabetes seems to improve. The hypertension seems to go down. The cholesterol seems to reduce. And when we put all this stuff together of being selfish, as demonstrated in the lifestyle heart trial, that 82% of the participants showed an improvement in blood flow to the heart muscle. That when we begin the process of moving towards being selfish, all right, selfish in a biblical fashion, that all of a sudden our telomeres begin to extend, which predict our longevity. Kansas, today I want to encourage you to get selfish. Get selfish. You want to get selfish so you can live a life of purpose. You want to get selfish so you can live the life that God intended you to live. You want to get selfish to reach the health state that you need to live. You want to get selfish for your community. And when you do this, getting selfish, and when you begin the process of creating an environment, a community, studies have shown that it can thwart the ill effects of racism. That individuals who came from a supportive and family environment, that they, despite exposures to higher levels of racial discrimination, it did not impact their future aging, their DNA aging. There's power that's there. Today, I encourage you to get selfish. Thank you all for taking time to listen.
Oh my goodness, Dr. Batiste, that was powerful. What a wonderful presentation. So our time is a little bit short, so we'll quickly try to get through as many questions as we can. But I would recommend that everybody re-watch this episode because it was fabulous. There's so much content here to process in 1 hour. So watch it again. So let's take our first question here with, let me see if I can find it again, with Keith. Can an individual live a healthy lifestyle and still have cardiovascular disease due to hereditary? How significant is hereditary in this process?
That's a great question. So what studies have shown is that it's really the lifestyle that plays the biggest role in nearly 80% as opposed to genetics. You know, the old adage is that lifestyle is the one that pulls the trigger. Genetics loads the gun, lifestyle pulls the trigger. So yes, you can live a healthy lifestyle, with underlying disease or underlying predisposition based upon what you choose to do and by getting selfish.
Excellent. And then we have another question from KR Rebuild. Should we totally eliminate fat and sugar from our diet, or in moderation, it's okay?
I think one of the key things is you want to eat food inside of its whole form. So as it relates to fats, if you're having seeds, chia seeds, flax seeds, if you're having small amounts of nuts, as I alluded to, that's where you're going to get your fats. That's a great source for fats and your omegas. As it relates to sugars, once again, fruits, vegetables, those things are great. Now, we can't live in a bubble, and we understand we're going to have it, but if you make your intentionality that I want to minimize those and I want to use whole foods more so than anything else, that's where you're going to see the greatest amount of improvement and benefit overall.
So will we be able to say that once a week is okay, or once a month?
You have to ask yourself, what's your why, right? So every day, do you ask yourself, is it okay for me to breathe, not breathe today? What's your why? You have to want it. To use the words of Eric Thomas, the hip hop preacher whose Adventist went to Oakwood University, you have to want it as bad as you can breathe. All right? How bad do you want your health? How bad do you want to impact your family's health in the future, and understand the importance of the interrelationship between your health and your financial health, right? Because if you're not healthy, you can't work. How you can't learn. So it becomes important for laying the foundation, and everyone understands that if I were to engage in something periodically, would that be the end of life? Probably not, right? But you
Right.
never know in your own body what is happening and what's lurking beneath the surface, waiting to raise its other ugly head. Last analogy. I know we're short on time. If you told me a year ago that war was about to outbreak inside of the Ukraine, now maybe the insiders would know that, but I didn't know that as far as I knew. But the tensions and turmoil have been there existent for a while. And that's the same thing from a health perspective in your body. You're walking around thinking, I'm okay. I can have it. I'm here to tell you that there is a lurking turmoil existent right now in your body, waiting to erupt in a war. And what you're doing right now is either feeding it or quelling the flames of strife.
Wow. Wow. Excellent. What a great analogy. Great way to think of it. And then Judy Ann Bailey is questioned, what about oils? I hear that we should never consume or cook with oils, including olive, avocado, sunflower oils. Never.
Yeah. So, that's a huge source. That's a long discussion. So I'm going to summarize it like this, is that the recurring data that comes through the literature tells us that probably extra virgin olive oil is okay. Here's the problem is that we fry in it. We grill it, we break it, we use exorbitant amounts of it, which is less than healthful, right? So I think we have to be very conscious of what we're doing, very mindful. And so I personally choose not to intentionally use oils, understanding that there's going to be situations where I'm going to have oils in certain things, right? And so I'm getting oils, and I try to make sure if that happens, it's an extra virgin olive oil.
Oh, wow. That's fabulous. Our next question from Sam Samuels is an interesting one. When you talk about going to church, are you talking about going to church physically, or does going to church online count?
That's a great question. So I'm gonna say, ouch there, Sam. Okay, you're talking to me too as well. Okay, get off my feet. But here's the scenario, right? These studies that I brought forth were studies that were speaking to in person, and so we can't really minimize. You recognize the other aspects of what I present in terms of the social isolation in that community, and so this community that's formed is part of the community of being present, the community of interacting and having a group that you feel a part of. And there is something that is indeed lost from a virtual aspect. There's something that's lost right now as I'm speaking to you. I don't have that interaction of your faces, or seeing whether or not I'm making sense, or if I need to be quiet and sit down. Right? I don't have any of that engagement. I can't embrace you. And so there is something that's always lost in the virtual platform that I believe, and studies will probably show this in the future, that may impact our health.
Yes, awesome presentation. And I'm reminded of Hebrews 10, I think it's 25, that says, don't forget the assembly. So thank you so much, Dr. Batiste. We're so sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but we really appreciate having you on. We so look forward to having you on again at a future date. So we have 2 flyers to remind you of upcoming presentations for supporting a healthy lifestyle. One is on glaucoma, World Glaucoma Awareness Day. That will be on March the 12th, a Sabbath afternoon at 3 p.m. by our wonderful Gilmo Henry will be your host on that day. And then we also have the very next day on Sunday, March 13th, we'll be celebrate the world of flavors. And this goes right along with what Dr. Batiste is saying, that we should have all these beautiful flavors and colors in our system. So we want to be ready for March 13th, that Sunday, as we hear from our dietitian. Thank you, everyone, so much for tuning in. We really appreciate you engaging with us. Our last thing that we want to leave you with, as Dr. Batiste says, it is a study has been done that shows church attendance decreases cardiovascular disease. We will see you at church next Sabbath at 11:30.